Cure EOS of Bulgaria asks, Raj, I thought your greeting in Russian last week was fabulous. Is this because Russians are your favorite people in the world? Well, Cure EOS, Russian employees are definitely among my favorite, but that doesn't mean I like all Russians. Which type of Russians do I dislike? It's Russian dolls, because they are so full of themselves. In the previous video, I discussed how organizational culture comes in two main varieties, abundance and scarcity. As we saw, abundance culture is characterized by mutual support among employees, whereas a scarcity culture is characterized by self-centeredness. As we also saw, there are three main domains in which the culture of an organization is reflected. The first and most important is employee treatment. In abundance cultures, employees are treated as assets, not as resources to be used as a means to profits. This means that abundance-oriented organizations are genuinely interested in every employee's well-being. This, in turn, means that the organization goes to great lengths and invests a lot of time and resources in their employees at every stage, starting with hiring. For example, in abundance cultures, hiring decisions are not taken lightly. Why? Because abundance cultures are like families. And so, just as we wouldn't let any Tom, Dick, or Harry into our family, abundance-oriented organizations do a lot of due diligence before hiring someone. In particular, they prioritize employee attitudes more than they prioritize employee skills. Here's Cheryl Huey of Southwest Airlines talking about why this is important. Listen.
Happiness is something that we look for when we're even recruiting employees. So I think we're all made a certain way, and I believe there are individuals that want to come in and see the more positive.
So as we just heard, Southwest Airlines thinks that attitudes are more important than skills because it's attitudes and the values that underlie them that shape organizational culture. And abundance-oriented organizations recognize that culture is much more important than skills. And just like hiring decisions, firing decisions too aren't taken lightly in abundance cultures. Here's Naren Dubey talking about how they come to fire an employee at Scan Cafe. Listen.
So we have a solid training program for every manager here that says, look, if somebody is underperforming and you've done your best, how do we get them to come up to speed? So we reinvest in their training. Whenever we speak to them about their so-called underperformance or not being on par with what we expect, it's always a conversation rather than a one-way street. We have mock sessions that we have videotaped on how to speak to somebody without insulting them. Basic rules of being compassionate while talking to somebody. And then even after 3 repeated tries, if they are not really being able to serve our organization, we start finding alternate career paths for them inside the company first and then possibly outside, and go out of our way to do that.
So employees at Scan Cafe are given lots and lots of support and training before they're let go. And when an employee is let go, Scan Cafe does its best to find that employee an alternative job. Of course, because abundance cultures hire carefully in the first place and continually invest in their employees, they rarely have to fire employees. So how employees are hired and fired is the first subdomain of employee treatment. The second subdomain is ongoing treatment of the employees. An important part of ongoing treatment is, as we heard from Naren, training. Another important part is voice, which, as you may remember from Module 3, has to do with whether employees feel safe to voice their true opinions and whether they feel that these opinions matter. Another important aspect is whether employees feel like they are included. This is related to bringing one's full self to work. Here's Srikanth talking about one of the many ways in which they try to make everyone feel included at Fractal Analytics. Listen.
It's very inclusive. All kinds of festivals are celebrated, number one. Number two is we create a bring your parents to work kind of a day where a lot of millennials and younger ones actually bring their family members. Some bring their children, some bring their parents, some bring both. So the idea is that your full self is engaged with Fractal. It's not that we're interested in your 8 hours of productive work and we don't care what else you do. We want your whole family to be part of the Fractal family. So that's how we do that. It's just been highly successful.
The third and final subdomain under employee treatment is power distance, which translates to how those lower in the organization are treated relative to those higher up. For example, does the CEO earn an obnoxiously higher salary than the average worker? Do C-suite execs enjoy a separate set of restrooms? What about parking? As we'll hear from Gary Ridge of WD-40, abundance-oriented organizations maintain greater equality on these and other dimensions than do scarcity-oriented ones. The second subdomain of culture is external stakeholders. The two main external stakeholders are customers and suppliers. And in abundance cultures, both are treated with a lot of genuine respect and dignity. For instance, abundance cultures consider interactions with customers to be an opportunity rather than a cost. Thus, when a customer calls in, an actual person picks up the phone rather than a machine. Tony Hsieh, the CEO, which is the ex-CEO of the billion-dollar company Zappos, claimed that this was one of the primary reasons why Zappos became such a customer favorite. Suppliers too are treated well by abundance cultures. In particular, they're paid fairly and on time, rather than being squeezed out of every dime and penny at every opportunity. Later this week, we'll hear Marshall elaborate on this. Another important external stakeholder is community, which includes not just people, but also the environment, rivers and forests and animals and birds, etc. How a company treats the environment speaks volumes about its values, whether it truly cares about compassion and contribution or is driven mainly by profits. As you can tell, the treatment of external stakeholders has to do with the organization's vision, which we talked about last week. The first subdomain under priorities, the third domain of abundance culture, is well-being versus profits. Abundance-oriented organizations prioritize the former over the latter. Here's Raj Sisodia talking about a consulting firm in Atlanta called JBN and what prioritizing well-being over profits means to that organization.
And there are some companies that are explicitly starting to recognize this, that the way we lead impacts the way people live, as we wrote in Everybody Matters. And I was just with a consulting company in Atlanta called JBN, and they have made it a rule in their consulting operations that all of their clients are local. Because typical consulting companies, you have to be at the client site 4 days out of the week at least. And those are typically somewhere else. So you're away, which means you don't get to see your kids hardly except for the weekend. Right? And the founders of this company said that's an unacceptable price to pay. We should not have to sacrifice those irreplaceable years with our young children simply because we have this job. So they made a rule that all our clients will be local, so consultants don't have to travel because the children are stakeholders, right? And their well-being is important, right, to us. And so the point is, there's no benefit to be gained by imposing that kind of suffering on people. And it just takes a consciousness of a leader to say, wait a minute, there's suffering, silent suffering happening. It doesn't serve any higher purpose. It's one thing if suffering serves a higher purpose. There's a lot of unnecessary suffering in companies and through work.
Doesn't JBN sound awesome? If I were in consulting, I definitely want to work there. Another subdomain of organizational priority is incentivization. Are employees incentivized through intrinsic rewards, like genuine words of appreciation and heartfelt thank yous after a job well done? Or are they incentivized mainly through extrinsic rewards, like Employee of the Month awards? As we'll soon see, it's better to prioritize intrinsic rather than extrinsic rewards to build a culture of abundance. The final subdomain of organizational priorities is short-term versus long-term orientation when it comes to profits and success. This is reflected in part in how the organization treats failures. As we learned in Module 5, you cannot gain mastery without stretching yourself and taking risks, which means that if there is to be any learning and growth in an organization, failures are simply unavoidable. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the greater the failures, the greater the potential for learning. But scarcity-oriented organizations don't recognize this. They punish failures. By contrast, abundance cultures recognize failures for what they truly are, learning moments. Here's Juliet Blake of TED TV talking about an experience she had at her company and how it made her feel. Listen.
Failure is not considered a sign of weakness in the best companies. Failure is considered something that we can all learn from.
If, as we just heard, failures are treated as learning moments in abundance cultures, how are successes treated? Well, successes are treated as celebratory moments. In particular, employees celebrate each other's successes rather than feeling insecure about them in abundance cultures. So, to summarize, there are 3 domains of abundance culture: employee treatment, external stakeholder treatment, and organizational priorities. And each of these domains, in turn, is comprised of 3 subdomains: hiring and firing, ongoing treatment, and treatment of employees in the case of employees, customer treatment, supplier treatment, and treatment of the community in the case of external stakeholders, and finally, well-being versus profits, intrinsic versus extrinsic incentives, and long-term versus short-term orientation in the case of organizational priorities. Well, that's it for this video. In the next video, we are going to turn to an all-important topic, the topic of measuring your need for abundance culture and how well it's being fulfilled at work. See you soon.